right, welcome and thank you for joining us for this webinar where we will give you clarity on the topic of worker classification, otherwise known as W-2 versus 1099, or maybe you've heard it as employee versus independent contractor. This is a hotly debated topic in many industries, but especially relevant for dental practices and dental professionals. So our goal for today is to give you practical guidance to elevate your staffing practices and limit your practice's liabilities. I'm Jeff Lane with Quickly Dental Staffing, and I will be moderating our session today. Brief word about Quickly. Quickly provides the best experience for practices seeking on-demand dental staffing solutions. Quickly makes staffing easy with its network of vetted W-2 professionals, easy-to-use platform, and reliable customer service. No minimums, no subscription costs. If you want to learn more or to create a free account, you can go to joinquickly.com. Now, without further ado, we have a great lineup of experts. So let me introduce our panel. First, we have Dr. Brian Laskin. Dr. Laskin is a dentist, tech entrepreneur, and author on a mission to help solve the biggest problems in dentistry through innovation, education, and standardization. He's the founder of multiple organizations, including Lake Minnetonka Dental, Upgrade Dental, Dental Standards Institute, and co-founder of Tooth Apps. He's the author of the Amazon best-selling book, The Patient First Manifesto, and the host of the Patient First podcast. Welcome aboard, Brian. Next, we have Amanda Spletstozer, Director of Operations with Quickly Dental Staffing. She has nearly 20 years of dental operations experience and has managed dental practices, including developing a startup office into a multi-million-dollar, multi-location group. Her leadership experience includes business administration, human resources, compliance, customer service, and clinical operations. Welcome, Amanda. We also have Stacy Christensen, who has 14 years of experience as a licensed dental hygienist in Minnesota and was a dental assistant before that. She has worked in multiple clinical settings, both a full-time and temporary staff member. For the last 2 years, she has worked exclusively in temping, and we are happy that she's been on the Quickly team since 2021. And finally, we have Paul Edwards, founder and CEO of Cedar HR Solutions. Cedar provides its members with one-on-one HR support, along with customized education, as well as employee handbooks. Paul is a featured contributor on the American Association of Dental Office Managers HR Tuesday series and provides practical guidance on leadership, managing employees, and employment law compliance on his HR podcast, What the Hell Just Happened, which for my money is the best HR podcast title you could probably come up with. Now I'm going to turn it over to Paul as he gives us a bit of a primer on worker classification.
As I begin today's short course on employee classification and our obligations as employers, I'm going to explain in basic terms what we all need to know when classifying a worker as either a W-2 employee or an independent contractor. I will focus primarily on the DOL's rules and will add an S-88 determination letter from the IRS at the end. The rules discussed today apply to all workers, and that includes part-time and temporary employees from staffing and temp agencies. Something to note. The criteria for making the determination has long been established by the DOL and the IRS. Recently, though, the DOL published new clarifying guidance, which makes it even more clear that practically all workers in healthcare are supposed to be classified as an employee and not as an independent contractor. Again, because the DOL and the IRS have overlapping interest in regulations regarding workers' classifications, we will address both during this presentation. Here are some terms behind the acronyms you're going to hear today. The DOL means the federal and/or state version of the Department of Labor. IRS, we all know what that means. FLSA, that's the Fair Labor Standards Act. That contains the federal laws and regulations that govern most of what we're going to be discussing today. UI is unemployment insurance. IC is independent contractor. WC stands for workers' comp insurance. Please note your state may have their own DOL, and they may have additional and more strict rules regarding employee classifications. Your state cares about misclassification in general because employee misclassifications by employers and tip agencies collectively cost states billions of dollars for things like taxes, unemployment insurance, workers' comp, and child support payments. Another thing to note here, and this is kind of a technical point to make, is that the criteria used by the DOL creates sort of a long list of things that need to be checked off in order for an employee to be classified as an independent contractor. Let's just say it's 50. They want to let you know that you could check off 49 of those 50 things and still fail the IC test. The 49 check marks carry no more weight than 1 point on the test, which you might fail. I'm going to demonstrate that the IRS works much the same way with much the same logic through an actual IRS determination letter. It's called an S-88 form, and I'll do that near the end of this short presentation. So next, let's look at what your obligations are as an employer. When someone comes to work for you, your first step must be determining their worker classification. For this presentation, your choices are W-2 employee or an independent contractor. As you will soon see, very few workers qualify as independent contractors. It's important to also understand that neither the IRS nor the DOL guidance states that you can bypass the classification rules by engaging a third party to manage a worker. You cannot absolve yourself of a classification obligation through a staffing agency when it comes to being a co-employer. Further, the DOL and the IRS will always attach responsibility based on the actual work setting and the party for whom the work is performed. So in all circumstances, misclassified or not, temp or staffing agency, or off an online job site, the feds place the ultimate responsibility for getting all this correct on you. The reason why we are here today is that in 2021, the administration attempted to rewrite the rules regarding temp employees and classifications. Several states sued, and a court struck down the key provisions of their changes. The administration came back and tried to rewrite a second component, the analysis test, which you heard me mention earlier, and that takes us to the next part. Because some but not all of the changes were struck down in 2021, the DOL decided to generate and share new guidance regarding classifications to make sure we are all giving the key components of the analysis that they've created the weight of consideration they require. Okay, everybody, let's get into the meat of the presentation and what you really need to know. On January 10th, 2024, the U.S. Department of Labor published the issuance of the final rule simply titled Employee or Independent Contractor Classification. It is effective March 11th of 2024. This final rule revises the department's guidance on how to analyze who is an employee or an independent contractor under the FLSA. Here is what they said. This final rule continues to affirm that a worker is not an independent contractor if they are, as a matter of economic reality, economically dependent on an employer for work. Consistent with judicial precedent and the department's interpretive guidance before 2021, the final rule applies the following 6 factors to analyze employee or IC status under the FLSA. This is their way of saying things are pretty much back to where they were, but we would like to clarify our position going forward. So please note that all of the following items have always been a part of the worker versus independent contractor analysis, but they've added a little beef to it. So, does the worker have an opportunity for profit or loss depending on managerial skill? Are there investments by the worker and the potential employer? The degree of permanence of the working relationship? The nature and degree of control. Number 5 is the big one that they brought, kind of bubbled up and made it a part of this analysis. The extent to which the work performed is an integral part of the potential employer's business. And then finally, skill and initiative. So please pay close attention to number 5. Across all types of medical and dental practices, really all kinds of businesses. Workers like injection specialists, PAs, hygienists, associates, front desk, insurance billing, front and back office workers, they are performing the integral work that your practice provides to your patients, and therefore this single factor, according to the guidance from the DOL, means they need to be classified as a W-2 worker. So next, let's move on to that IRS form I told you about. That's the Form S-88 letter, and it was issued in 2017. Here's what the IRS wants you to know. First, I'd like for you to note on the screen are several of the factors that were gathered by the IRS investigators prior to issuing the determination I'm about to share with you. This all comes from a 2017 Form S-88 letter. That comes from the IRS, and it's regarding the classification of hygienists. Before we get into the determination statement from this letter, let's talk about what the IRS intends S-88 forms to be used for. The first thing is these letters serve to make public their guidance from a determination and to make it available so everyone can follow the same guidance. They just want everybody to be on the same page. So they're saying this is our position. The other purpose is misclassified workers can also use them to inform the IRS that they believe they have been misclassified as an IC and that in fact you owe the taxes that they failed to pay or that you owe the taxes that you failed to withhold because you misclassified this worker. In this determination letter, the fact pattern presented was typical of what we see during misclassifications for dental hygienists and really all types of employees across medical industry. What is interesting is that as you look at all those bullet points in front of you, which represent the facts, you're going to see the IRS use a completely different segment of their test to quickly determine that practically all hygienists under the IRS rules are employees and not contractors. So pretty much they align with the Department of Labor. They just use a kind of a different reason, but you'll see it. I'm not going to read through all of the bullets that you see before you, but I'm going to jump straight to the IRS's determination. Here is what they said, and I quote, "Based on our analysis, we conclude that the firm had the right to exercise direction and control over the worker to the degree necessary to establish that the worker was a common law employee and not an independent contractor operating a trade or a separate business. The fact that the worker is a licensed dental hygienist and performs services part-time does not indicate an independent contractor. Dental hygienists are required by law to perform services under the direction and supervision of a fully licensed dentist. The worker cannot own her own practice or business as a dental hygienist. Therefore, whether she worked part-time or full-time, the same services were performed for the firm. The firm scheduled the patients and directed the treatments given. The worker was a trained hygienist, so direct supervision or instruction was not necessary. However, the firm retained the right to do so. The fact that the worker performed services for others, in many instances, including this one, also does not indicate a person is in business for themselves, but they're merely trying to work a full-time work schedule. In the instance case, she may have performed the same services for other dental facilities, but again, she would have had to practice under the direction of the officiating dentist. So that's really the key issue here, is that a hygienist must always be working underneath a dentist. Therefore, they cannot be their own business. We made it. That was a lot to parse through. I hope I've made three things clear from the DOL and the IRS guidance. Workers, regardless of the permanency or how they come to you, must be classified properly, and for most, the rules indicate that it is as a W-2 employee. The worker must be treated as an employee by either you or the temp agency. Regardless, you are responsible for the worker. If the temp agency suggests you hire them as an IC, I want you to know that it is an unsafe option under the existing rules. This means at a minimum that every employee must be background checked. You check their credentials. You HIPAA train them before they touch patient records. You fill out all tax withholding. The employee reads and affirms your employee handbook, and they also get a job description. So either you or the temp agency must do these things. It is perfectly okay for a temp agency to do all of the heavy lifting that we've been talking about and then charge you a premium for loaning you the worker. That has never been in question. Temping and staff agencies are quite valuable when they get this right. It has never been in question. It is not okay, according to the DOL, for anyone to pass the worker through and for you to pay them as an independent contractor. If you are out there listening to this and you want more information and education on this and other subjects, You can sign up for the best darn HR newsletter ever at our website. That's cedrsolutions.com. That's CEDR solutions.com. You can also join our Facebook group with over 10,000 members. It's called HR Basecamp, and when you're there, you can ask questions and kind of crowdsource. You can also subscribe to my weekly podcast, which is called What the Hell Just Happened. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. I want you to keep in mind that this is education and guidance. It's important that you always follow the guidance of either your CPA or an attorney when you're parsing through these sort of matters. So again, I hope you found this useful, and come visit us at the website and get more education and information.
All right. Thanks, Paul, for sharing that summary. I think that was super helpful to kind of sort through the rules and regulations. And there's a lot of kind of alphabet soup with the IRS and the DOL and all that comes together. So I appreciate you kind of sorting that out for us. Now, I would like to start to bring the rest of the panelists into this conversation. So I want to start with Brian. Brian, as a practice owner, how does labor compliance impact your staffing decisions, right? So like how would you advise practice leaders to maybe approach their thinking on classification and staffing?
It's a great question. And, I think, you said about starting off with compliance, and I can't be an HR specialist, right? And know about all the compliance laws with HR. So I would lean on Paul to give me those answers, number one, right? So for me, it's not as much about compliance other than making sure I'm doing what's right so we don't get dinged. It's more about what's best for the patients, what's best for the practice. And the good news is that those two are in alignment here, right? Like Richard Branson says, if you take care of your employees, they take care of your customers. In this case, if we take care of the people that work in our practices, they're going to take care of our patients, and we're going to have a better practice, right? There's some statistics like the dentists that have ownership in a practice produce 30% more than those that don't, even if it's a fractional ownership. And we all know, let's face it, if you have a part-time job where you're treated as sort of like getting paid cash on the side, you're not going to take it as with as much focus as you would if you're an employee. And so I feel like, the compliance issues are sort of outside of the scope of what I do as a practice owner, other than I know I need to be compliant. So I rely on the people like Paul to give me that information. But like I said, the good news is that these are all in alignment. If somebody is a 1099 worker through a temp agency, they're not going to be nearly as committed as somebody like a W-2 or like a quickly temp there's part of a culture that they're part of, that they're bringing to the patients. And so, while I'm not a compliance expert, I think here the two are in alignment. What's good for patients is good for the practice is also, which is probably where these rules and regulations come from in the first place.
Yeah, I guess maybe I'll shift that to Amanda too. Like as a former office manager and now an operations leader with Quickly, over thousands of dental hygienists and dental assistants. How do you see the importance of kind of classification and how that impacts the practice at the end of the day?
Yeah, for me, getting the classification of the employees right, I mean, to echo Brian, it makes it easier for everyone across the board. When I was running a dental practice, the last thing I was thinking of when we got in a temp hygienist or a temp assistant was all of that compliance, collecting the W-9, making sure the appropriate liability insurance covered them, figuring out the pay and all of that. And I mean, not even to get into the hassle of like the end of the year and sending out the 1099s. My focus as the manager at that moment was just making sure that I could get them up to speed on the schedule, the software, the process of the practice, and ultimately taking care of the patients. So, I mean, to sum it up, I wanted to focus on temps as a tool to take care of patients versus dealing with the compliance and the HR. And that's why at that point, W-2 temps made more sense to me. Transitioning to Quickly, It's important to me that as an organization at Quickly, that we focus on making that process easy as possible, not only for the offices, but for the professionals too. So as a W-2 employer of our temps, we support the offices and the professionals better because we're inserting ourselves in that W-2 employer relationship. And so for the offices, it means they're not at a compliance risk. They don't need to worry about paying the professional appropriately. They don't need to deal with all the record keeping and all of that. And then on the flip side, with the professionals, they can feel secure in their relationship with us. And that was, Dr. Laskin was sort of getting to. They know if they're injured, we've got their back. Or God forbid, there's another COVID pandemic and the industry shuts down, they'll be able to file for unemployment insurance because they're W-2. If they work overtime, they get extra pay, they could get benefits since we're W-2. Ultimately, the professionals have an advocate in us. And so it's just honestly making it easier on both sides. And as I reflect about 1099 versus W-2 from the agency perspective, it honestly would be easier for us to be a 1099 agency in a lot of ways. I mean, we wouldn't be responsible if someone got hurt. We wouldn't need to worry about, the cost of operating as a W-2 agency. The rates for the professionals, they seem kind of artificially inflated. So recruiting is easier if you're 1099, but we're not doing anyone any favors by putting everyone at risk to operate by using 1099 contractors or by being a 1099 contractor. And so if I had to boil it down, as a W-2 employer, it means we're focusing on that nitty-gritty with the compliance, the tax, the pay, and all those details so that the offices and the professionals get to focus on the dentistry, which is what matters to them. Paul, I'm curious though, like from the office perspective, what specific risk are they being put at by operating under the 1099 versus W-2?
Well, look, the risk are like I said, the relationship to the temp agency is kind of a pass through unless the temp agency is doing the right thing, hiring them as an employee. So the risk you have, whether it's a temp agency or someone just off the street answering an ad, when the person comes in and you think they're an independent contractor, maybe because they even asked you for that, they came in and said, "I want to be an IC. You just pay me directly. I don't want to be an employee." The risk you have there is that they're actually an employee. And so the Department of Labor doesn't care what you called them. They want you to call them the right thing, classify them properly, and put them into the system in the right way. But they're still an employee. So you've misclassified somebody. You're thinking of them as a 1099, and you may think to yourself, well, I think they're covered by, I wonder who's covering their workman's comp. Because if they're not your employee, they're not on your workers' comp. So if they get stuck in your office, if heaven forbid something, they get hurt, that could fall directly on you. Then you've got the IRS rules. You're not withholding taxes, so you're breaking those rules. You have your state rules, which I mentioned. So I guess to shorten this or end it, they're still your employee, even though you've misclassified him. If you were in California, that could mean that you've missed all of their lunch breaks. You haven't given them any of the stuff that you're required to by the state, which carries penalties with it. So whoever figures this out and looks back actually makes you responsible for everything, and your defense can't be, "I didn't know. They were 1099. Why are you dinging me for everything that happened for where they worked here part time for the last 2 years?" So, yeah, it's a big risk when you get it wrong.
Now, I want to also, Stacy, kind of shift to the professional side, because we've been talking a lot about the office side here. You have experience with being a full-time staff member, but also temping as both an independent contractor and as a W-2 employee. So like as a hygienist from a 1099 perspective, from an independent contractor perspective, like how did that impact your experience as a professional?
Well, the lucrative pay really drew me in, but then I knew that I would have to be paying my own taxes. I did not know about the workman's compensation and the no unemployment. Once I found that out, I prefer W-2 as an employee because first of all, it was very lucrative pay, sure, but 45% of my taxes was taken away. And then I did not know that if you got stuck or got hurt, the company didn't have your back. And then if if COVID happened, something like COVID happened again, I would not have been able to been covered with income. So it's all around, it's just better to be W-2 instead of independent contractor. So
Yeah, so in comparison, you said like those things are better, or you feel like more supported as a W-2?
I feel like it's safer to be W-2 instead of working as an independent contractor. It's just there's too many risks as a independent contractor. Um and yeah, it would be nice if all the stars aligned, but it's just too big of a risk.
Can I ask
Uh,
a question, Stacy?
yeah,
Do
go ahead.
you, how was it presented to you with the 1099? Did they prep you on a lot of the things you had to consider, or did you have to learn it on your own?
Well, I did know they presented it as a independent contractor. And then they even offered a service to deal with taxes. So I knew about that. They presented it, as such. So I knew about the taxes. I just didn't know how much would be taken out. Um, but I did not know about, they didn't say anything about if you got injured or about unemployment. I had to find that out through talk amongst us hygienists out in the field, in the offices, just amongst us when us hygienists are talking about 1099 versus W-2. So when I found out about the two big risks for me about the workers' compensation if I got hurt, or if something happened about COVID, like COVID, um, I wouldn't get unemployment. Those two things were big for me. So that they weren't upfront about. Um, they told me I had liability, but it was just a little, I don't really know all what the liability entails, but so I feel like they didn't misrepresent, but yet they did. There is omission. It was omitting some important things that I had found out amongst us hygienists out in the practices.
Yeah, I think that's why putting information out into the marketplace, into the industry is so important. And so like the work that Paul is doing and the work that Brian is doing to educate practices and professionals, I mean, and even quickly is also trying to put this information out into the public so that industry professionals understand what are the requirements, what are the risks, what are the options. And that's what's important, that if you're going to make a decision, that it has you have all the facts kind of factored into it.
Yeah, I want to highlight that because I think, Amanda said it well, that there are companies out there that don't tell you this because it's kind of easier for the agency to operate sort of in illegal, immoral fashion, right? And so yeah, and so people aren't telling dentists this, and so I appreciate that you're setting up this this webinar, Jeff, and all the work that you're doing, Paul and Amanda, to kind of highlight this because it is one of those things that most dentists don't even know about.
I also wanted to add, you listened to the presentation, a lot of what you heard me say, I'm reading from the IRS, and I'm reading from the Department of Labor and what they're actually putting out. The other thing is most of you out there have some access to a CPA. I'm not talking about accountant, but a certified, a CPA, or possibly an attorney who has expertise in this area. I just encourage you, go talk to them about this because they're really the authority on it. We defer to them. Even as an HR company, we need to defer to to the professionals that you're paying to give you guidance. I don't believe you're going to find a CPA or an attorney who will put in writing to you that it's okay for you to hire, for example, hygienist as an independent contractor. They have an obligation to follow the law and to follow these regulations. And so I encourage everybody to go to your advisors as well. And, you don't just have to take our word for it.
Right. Well, thank you all. I want to thank our panelists and thank our attendees for participating. We hope you gained a deeper understanding of the rules related to worker classification and how the right classification protects your practice and the professionals you work with. If you'd like to learn more or connect with resources for your dental practice, here's contact information for our panelists. They have a wealth of experience that you can tap into. I encourage you to reach out to them, connect with them in their organizations. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, everyone.